Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. My name is Megan, and my amazing co-host is.
Hi, I'm Amanda.
So this is not our typical super fuzzy intro because it's kind of a shoved in their intro. Last week in our first episode discussing Differently Wired, our greatest intention was to cover introduction and chapters 1 and 2. And at about 2 hours into that discussion, we were like, holy crap, this needs to be cut into 2 episodes. So this is the continuation, right? Remember when we were kids and they would do that like at the end of the TV series in the month of May, and it would be like to be continued, and you'd have to wait until September, right? But so thankfully, it wasn't that long of a to be continued. But yes, this is the to be continued continuation of last week's episode, so that the episodes are a little bit more bite-sized and digestible. So if you missed episode 1, go hop back, listen to it, and then pick this one up. And we're talking about Differently Wired by Deborah Reber. So we will now, in some sort of clunky editing fashion, just drop you into where we ended last week. Enjoy. All right, chapter 2. Are you shocked? I have the first note. This is shocking. Yeah.
It is a little shocking. We've been doing book club for quite a while. I feel a little out of my rhythm. I'm not going to lie. I'm not entirely sure what to do here.
You know what? And I mean, like you said, it's not a comparison because that's what we started talking about, right? But it's like, this is what dominates my life day in and day out, and the same as you, you know? And so it's like, all right. So on page 19, there's a quote here that talks about her kiddo being on a self-identity journey. And so she says, more than that, I love that Asher is showing so much interest in learning about his own tribe. I see it as part of the self-identity journey he's enthusiastically embraced in recent years. So first of all, I'm not sure if I don't tend to use the word tribe because I'm not sure if it's a word that we're supposed to, I think it's like powwow, like we're not supposed to use that word. But I will say this book is, I think, 7 years old. I looked it up when I was doing that because there's a reference later about boys and girls. And
there are a few things in here that I'm like, oh, language has changed quite a lot in that amount of time.
But I feel like the evolution of language and accessibility it's been big in 7 years. And so, and I've been to talks with Deborah Reber, and she's an incredibly generous and inclusive person. So I think if she were to rewrite this today, maybe some of those words would change. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that there. But I did love the fact that she talked about the fact that he's on this self-identity journey. These kids need to know who they are, avoiding a diagnosis or hiding the diagnosis from them. Right? How many times do we see, well, we haven't told them about their diagnosis because we don't want them to feel different. Spoiler alert, your kid feels different. At least if you give them the diagnosis, they understand why they feel different. And they understand like, oh, it's not because I'm an alien from outer space. This is who I am. This is how I'm made up. And it's not just okay. This is who I am. And it's great. And this is how I function. And this is what I need. And all of that stuff. So self-identity is huge, having that diagnosis and all that good stuff. So 100%. Then on 20, we both have some notes, but I have been monopolizing the conversation. So why don't you go first?
So she just has there's a quote in here that I really liked. And by the way, it's from this book called Neurotribes. And I immediately went and reserved it at the library because I'm still trying to limit my spending. The quote itself says, neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. There is no known cure. And I just thought that was hilarious. Her son tells her this quote from the book and, they talk about it. But it was it is hilarious, but also there's so much truth to it. And how different would the world be if we described everything in the same way? Normal, neurotypical, the standard or not, right? If everything got described with the same kind of language, how much better would we be about understanding where things are and where things stand? Because it's true, being neurotypical does tend to come with these characteristics. And people who are neurotypical need to realize that they come with these characteristics or are much more likely to lean towards these things. And how does that, where does that put them in comparison, in relation to others? Yeah.
and to understand how you're viewing the world versus how your kid is viewing the world, or your best friend is viewing the world, or whatever that might be, right? I built a class a while ago because there was a bug up my ass about the fact that there's so many classes out there for neurodivergent kids to teach them how to assimilate into the neurotypical world. And it's like, why are there no classes, or very few classes at a minimum, that are teaching neurotypical kids how to be a better friend to your neurodivergent friend? And so I built the class, and I mean, it's, if I do say so myself, stunning. I never got a single enrollment ever.
Mm.
And it is so complex and so in-depth. It gives so many great examples and all this kind of stuff. No one cares, right? It's so frustrating, because it's like, why are we putting the extra effort and the work and the onus on the neurodivergent people? Why is there no meeting in the middle of this, where neurotypical kids also need to understand these social situations? So anyway.
Maybe we should look at doing some of those things as like pre-recorded talks that are available to our Patreon people.
Well, I've got it built, and it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously it would have been nice if enough people were interested and willing, but like as a place, like a jumping off point of like education and stuff, we have the people, right? We've got the right kind of people that are going to be open to learning and hearing these things. So yeah, maybe that's something that we include in our Patreon. We should know that more.
And how helpful would that be too? Like, if you're a parent listening to this who's got an autistic kiddo, how helpful that might be for grandparents or something like that, who are just like not able to connect with, like, they're just struggling, right? We talked about,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say, we did an episode in season 1 that was about the importance of understanding and like accepting neurodifference and why everyone should care about that. And my mom messaged me and was like, I listened to that episode. It was great. You need to not market it just to homeschoolers. And I totally sent it to your dad and was like, you need to listen to this, because it's like so important, not only for like the grandkids and understanding the grandkids, but understanding ourselves and the people we work with and the people we're interacting with. Like, this is really good. There's such a need, and the ability to just forward something and be like, hey, I found this really helpful. You should give it a listen.
We're in the US. We celebrate Halloween in the US. I don't know how it's observed or not observed around the world necessarily, because it's not like a big, I know it's a big holiday for you. It's not for us. Costumes are not a go in my house for my autistic kiddos. So that's probably part of it. But, how many times do we have this argument throughout the weeks leading up to Halloween? If an adult shows up at your house in a costume, give them candy. They may be childlike in the way that they experience the world, right? Or if a kid doesn't have a costume on, they could be an autistic kiddo. If they can't say trick or treat, if they don't look you in the eye, like, and we have to have this. And there's all these people that are still arguing with the fact that it's like, it's a fucking Snickers bar. Just put it in a thing and say happy Halloween. And if they don't say thank you, just know that they're doing their best, right? Like,
I mean, for the most part, you spend like 5 cents on that piece of candy in your bulk bag of nasty things. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, just bite it in. Like,
yeah. But why do we keep having to do this? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And so, like, my oldest, he doesn't trick or treat anymore. But when he did, in his world, he was dressed up, right? But like, he would go as like one time, I think he was Steve Jobs one year, and he wore a black t-shirt and pants. And like, for him, that works, like that's a costume, and that's his comfort level. And, there'd be people, what are you just at? And I'm like, he said a trick or treat. Like, can you please just give him a candy? Like, why do we have to make this so complicated? Oh, so yeah, I mean, just as society in general, like, how much friendlier we would all be. You're going to run into, like, when I lived in the US in the South, Publix is like one of the big supermarkets, right? And a lot of the bagging people and even some of the cashiers and stuff like that are people who have learning differences. You're going to interact with people. Like, why not understand better how they experience the world so that you can meet them in the middle? Because they're out there doing their thing. The least we could do is meet them in the middle and make their day a little bit easier, more pleasant, whatever the case might be. Like, but it goes back to what we said in the beginning about equity and inclusion and kindness being now a political hot button. Anyway, okay, 21. We talked about my note already, where she kind of talked about dividing by diagnosis, and we talked about at the beginning, like, in my mind, it's not a reason to not get a diagnosis. Like, I get what she's saying there, but get a diagnosis. Anyway, what'd you flag on 21?
So she was just talking about how these days fewer and fewer parents would raise their hand when asked if they have a typical kid, right? She's kind of like, oh, if you're in a whole group of parents and said who has a typical kid, more and more parents are saying my kiddo's not typical. And I think there's some truth to that. But then I also think that, we're in the US right now. You're not in the US, but we're Americans and we're recording, and the vast majority of the people who listen are Americans. And like since the rise of Donald Trump and his devoted followers, right, there's this growing tendency among a certain population that isn't small, unfortunately, to insist that their kid is typical, even when they know that isn't true. And I think it's really sad. And I think the kids are the ones that will suffer always in those situations. And across, like, the kids will always be the ones that suffer when their parents or their caregiver, their adults, refuse to acknowledge and support who they actually are.
Well, and now we're in this world where it's 2025 and we're just slashing education budget like crazy. And you and I have talked about with that in the past, that these diagnoses, to get accurate diagnoses privately, is expensive as hell. And so there are plenty of people who do rely on the school system to get these diagnoses. And now all of that's going away. So even the ability to do that for so many people is becoming harder and it was hard to do. It was hard to do privately. It was hard to go through the system to do it. Now it's getting even harder, which is, again, the kids are suffering. It's just so sad. The pro-life, save the children people. We're worried about drag queens and all this other kind of stuff, but like things that are actually affecting our kids every single day.
All right. So I actually have the next note on page 22. She has a quote that says, "So at what point does the other become accepted and embraced for who they are? What's the magic number that will tip the scales to a place where these kids get their full invitation to participate in society? 25%, 30%?" And for me, it just reminded me of that Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote about how many women should be on the Supreme Court. And she's like, when all of them are women, then it'll be fair, because for years and years and years, it was all men. So like, I don't think it will take the whole classroom, right, to be full of differently wired kiddos for it to actually make a difference. But it's definitely going to take way more than 50%, in my humble opinion. I think you have to be way more than the number that considers themselves the majority for it to actually start seeing any kind of shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I had a note on that same page here. She's having a conversation. They're out for a picnic and she's having a conversation with her husband about this article that she read. And it talks about the risks of having an autistic child. And her kiddo cuts her off mid-sentence and is like, risks? Like a disease? Like what's the deal here, right? And it's like the power of those words. Like you just said, words matter, right? Pet versus service animal and stuff like that. And so it reminds me, so I worked at OutSchool for a really long time. I still teach on OutSchool, but I worked actually for the company for a really long time. And I'm a gentle parent. We've talked about this before. I'm huge about language choices. And there are classes on there that I would go to the supply team and say, like, why are we allowing us? Why are we not taking a stand and being more pro-kid? And every time it was like, here she is complaining again. For example, if you go in the OutSchool search catalog and type in the word struggling, the number of classes that will come up is no small thing, right? And so it'll be like reading tutoring for struggling readers. It would be a cold day in hell before I ever signed my kid up for a class that said, hey, by the way, you suck at this in the title. Like, why on earth? If you are a reading tutor, does it not go without reason that you could help a struggling reader? Like that feels like common sense. And I get it. It's marketing and you're trying to hit the algorithm and all that kind of stuff. But why are we doing that at the sacrifice of our kids' mental health? And then I think, like, imagine you have a kid who's in that tutoring session and they have a really positive week and they're feeling good about themselves. And then the next week they go to log into class and they click that link again and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a struggling reader. And it's like that little boost of confidence that you just got shot apart. It's just gone again. And so it's like, please, 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 like, look at that kind of stuff. I get that you're like, oh, my kid struggles with reading. This would be a great class. Your kid's going to see that every time they log in. And I wouldn't want my kid in a class with a reading tutor who's like, you've struggled, kid. Every reading tutor should be able to do that. Let's find one who's going to be positive and uplift our kids instead of smacking them in the face with their insecurities. There's a ton of stuff on there. If you start to look at stuff through that lens, it's there. Outcool is a marketplace. There's amazing stuff on there. My kids take classes on there. And then there's some stuff that needs to be sifted out. And because they're a marketplace and their teachers are independent contractors, they don't do that sifting. So it's up to us as parents to do it.
Yeah. I mean, kind of along those lines, right? I struggle with this, and we've talked about it more before in previous episodes. So if you want to know all of my thoughts on it, you should go back and listen to some of the other episodes that we've had on this. But on page 22 and 23, there's this discussion about words mattering. And again, I fully believe that words matter. In it, and she's talking about, being careful to use positive words versus negative words and those sorts of things. And again, generally speaking, I agree with that. There is this push towards positivity and away from clinical wording, and I'm not totally here for it. Like, I just saw something this past week that was like other words you can use, like harmful words, neutral words, and then the words you should actually use. And while I don't believe that the medical or the clinical words should have the negative connotation that they do, I also don't necessarily understand why we are so quick to downplay the differences, the struggles, and the challenges. I will fully admit there are some points here in the book where I was typing up my notes and she used the word deficit and I changed it to weakness because I feel like deficit has a stronger negative connotation, but it's still a weakness. I don't want to say like, oh, it's a difference. Like, okay, it's not difference. It is a weakness. And to say otherwise, I feel like it's just toxic positivity is still toxic. That's my bottom line, right? There are differences, and refusing to say that the difference is a struggle or is a challenge or is a weakness, like toxic positivity is still toxic, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then on page 23, she kind of shifts gears a little. And the quote that I pulled out says, so how can you know if your child is differently wired? Blah, blah, blah. Here's how I suggest you approach this question. If you believe your child is differently wired, then he or she probably is. We may or may not have a diagnosis. We may simply recognize that some aspects of our child's life will be more than that of our peers. More intense, more emotional, more intelligent, more difficult, just more. We may have noticed a disconnect between our child's performance at school and what we know they're capable of. We may have recognized that our child struggles where other kids sail through with confidence. The kids in our community are caught in a kind of limbo since many are living with invisible differences that aren't so easily perceived or recognized from the outside or out of context. And it's kind of a long quote. I know I read a lot, but that idea, like, first off, if you're wondering if your kid is differently wired, they probably are. Second off, it's hard. It's hard to figure it out, and that's okay. We're here for it. We're here to provide support. And there are a lot of people out there as well. She's got a community. We've got a community. And third, we hear a lot. There's a lot of information out there about invisible illnesses, but this is that same kind of idea, right? Like a lot of these kids who are differently wired, it seems kind of invisible because there's no obvious, this is what the issue is. This is where the challenges are. And without that, it's easy for it to get brushed aside or for that thing to like, well, they just need to try harder. They just need to do this differently. And so, yeah, we want to be aware of that. I'm sure we're both going to have lots to say on the next. So now she kind of gets into a lot of the buckets that she sees in her community and that she's considering differently wired. So the first one she listed as ADD/ADHD. And my big thing was I just wanted to clarify that in the United States, ADD is no longer a medical diagnosis. Okay, the diagnosis is ADHD with 3 subtypes or 7 or 12, depending on who you're listening to. I don't know now. I know that as of a few years ago, ADD was still diagnosed outside of the United States because of an issue with translated medical texts and things like that. I'm not sure if that has changed yet, but in the United States, no one is receiving an ADD diagnosis anymore, just so that we're all on the same page.
Mhm. There's also some stuff in here on 25. And I think it goes without saying with the amount of thoroughness we've shared with this book that this is a book that you should get if you have and fully read, right? That our digest is not doing it justice here. But there was that article a couple of years ago about why French kids don't have ADHD.
Several years
Yeah.
ago at this point, but yeah,
Yeah.
French kids don't have ADHD.
And it's parenting. We're all shit parents if your kid has ADHD, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff on here and how after the fact, it turns out, oh my gosh, French kids have ADHD. You would not believe it. Holy cow. So that's worth reading because that was ridiculous when it came out and it's still ridiculous.
So I think everyone knows the viral opinion article, Why French Kids Don't Have ADHD, right? But what most people missed, because it's not nearly as fun on social media, is that 2 years later, this same publication put another article out that said French kids do have ADHD and it's not all about parenting. But that didn't get the same kind of traction.
Yeah,
Which,
it's not as much fun.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. Okay. Then on page 27, I think your note comes before mine.
Okay. So yeah, on page 27, she is running through a list of things that are common with ADHD. So she lists trouble focusing, daydreaming, being disorganized, being impulsive, having a short fuse, constantly interrupting, trouble reading social cues, and feeling the need to fidget or constantly move. And then she says, quote, put all these traits together and it's easy to understand why kids with ADHD present a challenge in the classroom. I totally get it. Yet treating these kids like ill-behaved children who can be punished or suspended out of their behavior, as many schools do, doesn't just do them a huge disservice. It's undeniably harmful.
Yeah. And discriminatory.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I totally agree with it. That said, I also kind of get it, right? Like the reality is this shit is hard. There are absolutely times when I'm trying to teach my kiddo something and his fidgeting makes it impossible for me to maintain my focus and train of thought on whatever we're talking about. He's clicking a pin or he's hitting something or he's shaking the table and I can't focus on what I need to share with him as the teacher in this particular moment. And like it's hard, right? I can't teach him if I can't focus, and he can't learn to the best of his abilities if he can't focus, which requires the fidgeting. The struggle is freaking real. And the reality is there are times I'm like, I need you to stop that right now. Like, please stop shaking the table while I finish this. And sometimes you're in a place where you can be like, this is going to go on for a little while. Can you find a fidget toy? Can you find something you can do that is less distracting for me that also works for you? And sometimes you're just like, I need you to stop what you're doing right now and just listen to me for another 30 seconds and then you can resume, right? It's hard. It is hard.
It is. Their fidgeting is what allows them to focus. And to your point, Amanda, we got to come to some sort of an arrangement that works for us both, right?
Yes, but then it's not stop who you are.
Yeah, exactly. So on page 28, I thought it was interesting. There was a quote here that said, if you think about it, people with ADHD are the only people who are asked to change who they are. Kids in special education aren't asked to change their learning differences, but instead to learn additional skills. But we are asked to change. We are wrong. And this is a quote from Yafa Crane Luria, an ADHD parenting coach who herself is ADHD. And it's so true. For example, we talked about before, like these ADHD kids are punished in school or disciplined for their behaviors. Are you going to punish a type 1 diabetic because they get woozy and disrupts the class because they need to go get a sugar tablet from the nurse? No. Then you shouldn't be doing the same thing for an ADHD kid. It's different, but it's not, right? Okay.
Yep. No, exactly. On that same page, she goes into her next thing, which is on giftedness. And for me, the inclusion of this is what really made this book revolutionary for me. I read it before we had any kind of actual diagnosis. Like I knew my kiddo was gifted because of school stuff, but we did not have a twice exceptional diagnosis yet. So this idea that like, oh, gifted, his brain really is differently wired was like a real light bulb moment for me, which is kind of sad because I was a gifted kid. I mean, you're not a gifted kid and then you're not gifted anymore, but like that was okay in my life, my experience. And yet this was never really put out there for me. And I'm 100% different. I'm my own person. I'm an oddball and I'm totally fine with that. I'm completely content with who I am as a person, though I'm always looking to improve and grow and all of that jazz. And that's all part of that neurodivergence, right? Like that being differently wired. It is 100% true that people say these kids already have a leg up, so why would they need extra support? And if there are people saying that, you can be absolutely sure that even more people are thinking it. We did an entire episode on giftedness. We could have done an entire series on giftedness. But basically, right, in a nutshell, truly gifted kids, this is not the like, oh, my kid does good in school, or the parent who says, oh, my kid is gifted. Truly gifted kids have brains that are wired differently. It's what allows them to learn so quickly. It's what allows them to see connections that many people miss. They are differently wired, and not just in a singular get good grades kind of way.
Yeah, completely. And in fact, there's a quote on page 28 by Julie Ross. It says, Julie Ross had a similar point of view when we explained the challenges we were facing with Asher a few months later. She said, quote, I've never had a parent come to me and excitedly exclaim that their child is gifted. If they do, then I know that child probably isn't actually gifted, because highly gifted children are typically very challenging. In fact, being highly gifted is actually a special need in its own right, she explained. And I think both of us would completely agree with that, and the hell to the yeah. And for me, it makes me uncomfortable saying that my kids are gifted, because there's that whole, my kids are gifted, that's like constant. And I don't want to be that person. You know what I mean? And it's like, and we're not even talking apples to apples when you're doing that. You can't fathom the intent. I mean, I started it intense, right? Like that's all I can say. And it's freaking exhausting. So yeah.
Yeah.
My piece.
Yeah. Yep. I'll just leave it at that. Yep. So on that same page on 29, she's talking about the assessments basically. And she says, quote, the most typical way for a child to be identified as gifted is when their teacher, noticing their ability, nominates them to take an IQ test. Some public schools do a general standardized test for all kids in second or third grade. Some of them recommend. There's different ways of doing it. I have no idea what that's going to look like in the future because of what's happening with the Department of Education and all of this stuff. But I do want to say she points it out some, and I'm going to highlight it more. There are so many issues with this and this way of identifying kids. First, IQ tests are not great tools due to cultural and socioeconomic issues. Hopefully you know that. If not, that's okay. Feel free to read more on it or message us to discuss it further. We're happy to have that conversation. Second, not all schools, in fact, probably not many schools, are actually prepared to accurately assess giftedness, even via the standardized testing that they use. In our own family, that is an excellent example of how that plays out, right? Thank goodness we worked with our pediatrician to get testing done before the public school so helpfully did their own assessment. We were concerned specifically, he was already identified as gifted. Okay, fine, whatever. Then we had a learning disability type concern, a very specific concern, and we weren't getting anywhere with the public school. So we went to our pediatrician, who was like, I can totally see this profile and how you were completely blown off because he's doing so well in school. But I do think that it's worth checking into, and here are some clinical educational psychologists that I recommend. We went with one. It was phenomenal. I'm so glad we did it. We got great information. It cost him, Megan's not wrong, it cost way too much, and insurance doesn't cover it if it's just learning disability. If you have something that's a medical diagnosis, they will oftentimes cover it, but not in our case, even though we got a DSM diagnosis, which is a whole other thing. That's one of my soapboxes I could get on for hours, but I won't. But we got great information that really helped us figuring out how to homeschool well. We got such solid recommendations and ideas and suggestions from doing this. I'm so glad we did. Then the school that we work with was like, oh, we're going to do our own assessment so we can figure out, like, oh, this is going to be great. The school's assessment came back that not only was he not twice exceptional, but they actually put him at below average intelligence. And they didn't even care. Like they presented this and they're like, oh, not even like average, like at the bottom of like the average, like thing. And I was kind of like, well, like your standardized test, we do standardized testing 3 times a year with your school. We're required to. And he's always in the 99th percentile in everything. Like, I'm curious how he could be in the 99th percentile on all of your standardized testing and be below average intelligence. And they were just kind of like, well, that's what the numbers say. I'm like, that's what the numbers say. No, you're a moron. But it was one of those things like I actually really went to bat with them, not because I needed it for my kiddo. I knew where we were. I had great information. I have lots of resources from different programs that he's in and things like that. But I'm like, this school is going to completely misdiagnose kids of color, kids from other communities that are, like it's going to be ugly. And they're really going to hurt kids whose parents are like, oh, I guess, because they just don't know. And I really went to that. I don't think I changed everyone's opinion, but I definitely educated a few people who were like, thank you. That's really helpful information. Like yeah. So anyway, I share all of this to say assessments can be good and they can totally be bad.
Yeah.
And as with anything that is medical in one way or another, whether it has to do with the brain or the physical other parts of the body, like a second opinion is never a bad thing. If you get it and you're like, I'm not sure on that, get a second opinion.
Yeah. I had my oldest assessed 3 times because I truly didn't trust the diagnosis the first time, not because I was like stigma wise again, like my child, I just didn't see it. I truly didn't. And I didn't feel like the doctor was thorough enough and this and that. So we did it again. And I didn't, and she's, it's been over the years too, right? As he grows and evolves and changes. So, but it turned out the same every time.
Well, but I mean, there's much to be said for that. Right. Whereas for us, like the first time we got these really important pieces of the puzzle, the second time was like pretty useless. And we're actually just looking at doing a third smaller version, but a third one for some more information around stuff that got covered a little in the first one, but the first assessor that we saw, she definitely had a strength in one area and not in another. And so that thing, when she says, well, this kiddo is at the top, that I've never seen another kid that high in this thing. Like, okay, well, of course, as a parent, you're like, oh, that feels good, right? But the reality is, if she's never assessed as a student that looked like that with that profile, she's not the
Somebody who
best.
has.
Yeah.
Right.
She's not the best one to give you all of the information on that. And so now it's time to go a little further in that. So I can laugh at you for doing 3 times, but we're about to do our third to there you go. Step.
On 29 and 30, she starts to, actually, I think it's 30, she introduces overexcitabilities. And so we are getting long with our episode, but if you are unsure about overexcitabilities, they are defined by the advocacy group that's supporting the emotional needs of the gifted as inborn intensities, indicating a heightened ability to respond to stimuli. And I've talked about it before. My kid will just completely shut down. I mean, he will, to the point that it's physical and there's vomiting involved and it's a whole situation. It's really fun. So if you're in that boat and you are looking for support, I think unless somebody has that in their world, like you severe, intense, the world stops OE tendencies, it's a little hard to explain to people. You feel a little bit like a flake when you have to call somebody and be like, my kid is vomiting and they're going to do that for like another 3 hours and then they're going to sleep for like 5 hours, but then they'll be fine. So can we move to tomorrow? And I'm like, it's a pattern. We do this. It's fine. Every birthday, every Christmas, like we do this, So overexcitability is, if you're trying to pinpoint what that is and you've not heard that term before, it's worth looking into because it is a dominating force in my life.
Yeah, it is. And we talk about it quite a bit in our gifted episode that we recorded towards the end of season 1. So yeah, you can go back and give that a listen.
It was season 2.
Was it? Good Lord. I'm like, all right, I'll take your word for it. At the beginning of season 2, then. Jeez, yeah. Gosh. Okay. All right. So then she moves on to talking about learning differences. And that's what she calls them. Again, I have thoughts, but basically this is like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, those kinds of things. There were two that she included in here that I really wanted to pull out for anyone who's listening and not already well educated on this. One, slow processing speed can result in even the brightest of students crashing and burning on, for example, timed math tests or written exams. When a teacher knows a child is more than capable, the poor showing can be misattributed to laziness or lack of preparation, and the child is told to just work harder or apply yourself. And I think that's a really important one. So many people don't realize that's a separate thing. It can be diagnosed on its own. It's often, not always, but often diagnosed with something else, like maybe ADHD or gifted. Like it's often in there in the mix, and it's not your kiddo's fault. It is well beyond their ability. The same with the next one. Deficits in executive functioning skills can lead to all kinds of challenges for students. And again, unless an educator is highly tuned in, there's a good chance they'll chalk up the challenges to laziness, sloppiness, or a poor work ethic. Think of the child who repeatedly forgets to turn in his assignments, even when he did them the night before. The student whose locker is so messy that the contents spill out onto the floor every time she opens it. Or the student who struggles to begin even the most straightforward writing assignment, perpetually runs late, or has poor impulse control. Executive functioning skills, so important. If they're not there, it's not your kiddo's fault. They just need practice. They need to work on them. They need to build those. Just so important. I just saw a discussion in one of my parenting groups about kids not submitting their homework. And it was all about how important it is to crack down on them now because they're middle school age. And if you don't crack down on them now, it'll only get worse in high school. And it just made me so sad because for the most part, those kids don't need crackdown as much as they need targeted help with skill building and, executive function life skills. And there are lots of resources out there. There are classes, there are books, there's so much. So if you see that, there's some great articles that kind of like walk through what a day in the life of a third grader who has slow processing speed or has executive functioning skills deficits, like read that. And if you're like, oh my gosh, that is my kid, that is me, like I'm so frustrated by these things, then go look. There are great websites, there are great books, there are great resources. We're happy to help point you in the right direction. These are things, there are specific tools and things you can use and implement that do not involve just work harder. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing this?
I mean, think about yourself in any environment, right? And how many contexts do you function better with a good crackdown, right? I mean, they're just small adults, right? They're just small little people. And so it's like, I go back to like my, days in the corporate world. And I mean, every management training class you ever went to was like, partner with your people, listen to what they're struggling with, help them. Nobody benefits from a good crackdown. I shouldn't say nobody, but very rarely and the kids are no different. It's not a mystery.
Yep. All right. So on page 34, she goes into the section entitled Asperger's, Autism, and something else. I just wanted to make a quick note. Again, we kind of mentioned it before. Some of the language in here is a bit dated because a lot has changed. Just so you know, if you're listening, Asperger's is a really problematic term. There are people who still identify with it. We're not going to tell them that they're not allowed to identify with it, but we're not encouraging anyone new to pick it up and run with it. It's like a whole thing around Nazi eugenics and a way to identify who was worth saving and who wasn't. So like, just please be aware.
Which RFK is really bringing back. There was a whole thing about sending ADHD people to work farms and okay. I mean, it's so frightening.
I mean, there's a whole thing that Elon Musk might actually be, what was it? A Aspie supremacist, which is like this whole idea that Asperger's people are meant to lead the world into the next whatever and are superior and he's white. So he's like even more superior. It's like, yeah. So
Yeah.
Good times, exactly.
I'll add to the Asperger's things too. Again, the book is 7 years old. There's stuff in here about high functioning autism being like a new and up and coming term. It's almost worked its way through the system and on its way out at this point, right? So And we talked about this when Jonathan Mooney was on, that there's a lot of disconnect within the neurodivergent community about how people want to be referred to, what they will accept, what they find offensive, etc. And so a lot of that is still shifting. I know in the circles that I travel in, high and low functioning is not typically acceptable terminology. We would say high support needs or low support needs. Nonverbal is also kind of moving its way out. There are more respectful ways to identify people. And then there's a whole conversation in here about identity first versus person first, as far as somebody being an autistic individual, not a person with autism. And so it's just important to figure out what those things are. And they are shifting. So we do need to kind of evolve with those until we kind of settle at a point where everybody goes, yeah, we've reached it. This is it. This is what we like.
We might not get there. I mean, this might forever be one of those things where it's a really person specific kind of thing. And so, being aware of what's most generally accepted, and then also being aware of the fact that if you know someone or you're talking to someone, it's worth finding out. It's the same thing as the pronouns, right? Like you can get your panties in a bunch about, I know what they look like a girl, so I'm going to call them a girl. Like, why? Like if they're like, you know what, actually, I'm disabled and I'm fine saying that I'm disabled. And I would prefer if you said it that way to me instead of saying, oh, well, I'm differently abled. Like, no, bitch, I'm not differently abled. I'm freaking disabled. If I could get in my car and drive wherever I wanted to go, maybe we'd be having a different story, but I can't. Like, I'm freaking disabled, right? Like,
be able to me in your case would be like, instead of being able to drive your car on the freeway whenever you wanted, you could like fly somewhere because you have a different ability than the average person. Instead, you just don't go places.
Yeah.
Someone to take you there.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's not differently abled. That's unabled. Thank you. So, yeah. All right. So, yeah, again, just, language is important. It's changing. It's hard. We get it, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say I get it right all the time. I don't by any means get it right, probably even 50% of the time, but it's worth being aware. The next thing she covers on page 36 is twice exceptional. The definition is intellectually gifted people with at least one neurological difference. She goes on to say, twice exceptional kids often find themselves in an especially tricky spot. In some cases, a child's giftedness masks their neurodifference. They're so bright that they're able to compensate for their weaknesses, but inevitably, their weakness catches up with them, and it's often at a point when some aspect of school or learning has become incredibly frustrating and their self-confidence has taken a significant hit. The flip side of that is more common, though, are kids whose neurodifferences mask the giftedness. Think about it. If a child is reading below grade level or is constantly bombing on math or written assignments, most people's first thought isn't going to be, oh, this child must be gifted. Okay. So yeah, twice exceptional is 2E. We often talk about it. We often shorten it to just the 2E. So it's literally the number 2 and the letter E, but that stands for twice exceptional. And it's this idea of kids who are diagnosed as gifted, but also have some other kind of neurological difference or differently wired thing going on.
And there's a quote in the book by Dr. Devin McEachran. Sure, I got that wrong. Who basically, I'm going to summarize, just basically says there's rarely a good school fit for these kids. Because if it's a school that's amazing with gifted kids, they have no clue what to do with autistic kids. And if it's a school for autistic kids, they are very confuzzled about the giftedness component. And so there's a lot of 2E homeschooled kids in this world for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah, so. Absolutely. The next one she covers on 38 is anxiety. She highlights the intolerance and lack of awareness. We kind of brushed on that, touched on that earlier. And then she also does point out that anxiety rarely travels alone. ADHD and anxiety, giftedness and anxiety, autism spectrum and anxiety. The fact that it can and does manifest differently also makes it a challenge, right? It's one of those things. It's hard to pinpoint, but it makes it no less real. More serious, significant, all of those things. For me, I pulled out on page 39, she has the out of sync child. She talks about it and how her pediatrician told her to read it. Did you read it? Did you get that recommendation?
I've read that book. And there's also the out of sync child has fun, I think. There's like some spinoffs. Yeah.
Okay. I just think every caregiver that's ever read that book finished that book feeling like both validated and frustrated. Like, okay, I've got some new things in my toolbox. Like, this is great. But then also that letdown of like, but why can't I get real help with this?
Yeah.
And it's because it isn't technically a real quote unquote medical diagnosis according to the DSM or the ICD-11. And this is in, sorry, I should have started with, this is specifically with sensory processing disorder and things in that category.
Yeah. And my note about that whole section was my youngest was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder very young when he started telling us that he wished he didn't have teeth and that food was poisonous and basically didn't eat, didn't sleep, like nothing. I mean, it was just, and it was brutal because to try and order in a restaurant or something like that, like no one understands sensory processing disorder. And it was literally the best day of my life when he finally got an autism diagnosis, because we would go to Mod Pizza, for example, which we can no longer do because they changed an ingredient in their crust, and a child with sensory processing disorder will know that immediately and will no longer eat it. Thank you, Mod Pizza. Sent them a message about it, never heard back from them. So not even like a form letter. Thank you. I spent a lot of money on pizza because it was like one of the 5 foods the kid eats. But I could literally walk him up to the counter at Mod. It's like a counter thing where you go down like, and they, like, it's like stations, right? And I'd be like, he's autistic. Can he give you very specific instructions? No problem. Right. And they would be like, let us know exactly how much sauce you want, because that was like one of the big factors and stuff like that. Right. And when you say autism, I don't think people fully understand autism in the general world, but they think they have a better idea of it. And they're typically at least be like, oh, this sounds familiar. And I know that I'm supposed to be accommodating to you, is generally like the reaction. And that's great. Sensory processing disorder, people are like, I'm pretty sure you just made that up. Like, I think, yes. And you didn't, but man, it's hard to get support. So the autism diagnosis is a gift.
It is. And I was really surprised. I did a little bit of quick digging. I was surprised to find that most of the symptoms of sensory processing disorder are only found in the DSM under autism spectrum disorder. But it made a lot of sense for me because I remember going with my young child and saying, like, I know he gets it from me a bit because I don't like having my hands dirty. And when I was growing up and we would have to do yard work and things like that, right? I always would like put rubber gloves on because I hate the feel of dirt under my fingernails. Like, it drives me absolutely nutty. And so like, I'm going to put rubber gloves on and then my garden gloves to make sure that nothing gets under my fingernails. But homeboy like took it quite a few steps past that and just like didn't, like, had real issues with, like, Play-Doh was hard and it took years to get to the point where we could go enjoy sand in any fashion and these kinds of things. And I went to our pediatrician and she was just like, she asked some questions, which in hindsight now I realize was like an autism kind of screener. And then she just said, well, what does he usually do? And I was like, well, he washes his hands, like when something gets on him that he doesn't want, like, it's like, go wash the hand, like, until the hands are clean, like, she was like, well, washing his hands often is not a bad thing. And so we'll just wait until he gets to school. And if we find that it's impacting his life in a negative way, then we'll look at it. We'll address it. And it ended there. There was nothing else done about that or any of the other symptoms or things. And generally speaking, we have a great pediatrician. I really like her. But this is kind of one of those things where, if SPD was an actual medical diagnosis, would those kinds of conversations be handled quite differently? Probably, and that's too bad for a lot of families.
Yep.
All right. So we are almost done. I just really loved the fact that she wrapped up this chapter with a quote from a science writer named Steve Silberman. I'd never heard of him before. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but the quote says, in forests and tide pools, the value of biological diversity is resilience. The ability to withstand shifting conditions and resist attacks from predators. In a world changing faster than ever, honoring and nurturing diversity is civilization's best chance to thrive in an uncertain future. And like, it's great. That thing of like, you don't really think about it, right? But in so many situations, you need biological diversity for survival. And yet somehow in humans, throughout history, we've tried to get rid of that diversity,
Sameness.
Somehow thinking that that's going to help us survive. Like, I don't know.
And now getting rid of anything that helped people who were in any way, shape, or form different exist in the world peacefully seems like a really great plan. Okay, great. This is good. All right, so that wraps us up for today. Amanda mentioned earlier that we have a Facebook group, but if you'd like any more Meagan and Amanda time, we also want to let you know that we host a Patreon. It is a budget-friendly way to sink your teeth into even more content while further supporting our little independent media source here. We offer 3 levels of support, and you can choose from perks like themed unit studies and live meeting. In our live sessions, we cover custom homeschool support and opportunities to socialize with like-minded homeschool parents. So we'll pop a link and a coupon code in the show notes, but we hope you'll join us there.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for joining us today. We will be continuing our discussion of this awesome book. Again, Differently Wired is the title. We talked about it a lot today, but it's called Differently Wired. Next week, we'll be covering chapters 3, 4, and 5. 5 is really short, so don't stress. So yeah, tune in for more. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.